Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you all for being here this morning for our early morning first panel. Thank you for being here to this 13th Black New England Conference here in Manchester. We're delighted to be here in Manchester. Our first one expanded beyond the seacoast, so we thank you. My name is Jerry Ann Bogus. I'm the Executive Director for the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire.
And my name is Dennis Britton, and I'm the Vice President of the Board of Directors for the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire.
So our theme this year, we choose to do the theme on the Black news this year because there have been lots of talks about journalism and fake news, so we wanted to go to the source of the news for the African American community, the original starting of the Black press.
All right. And last night we had our keynote address by April Ryan. And who was here last night? All right, a lot of you were here last night. If you weren't here, you should have been here last night. One of the big things I took away from Ms. Ryan's address was the importance of asking questions. We as citizens, we as people of color, we as humans on this planet do not always feel empowered to ask questions of those who are in power. And she really inspired us to think critically and to ask the tough questions and not be afraid to ask the questions of those who are in power. She also really impressed upon us the need to support the press and to support our journalists, that they are the ones who are out there. And in our age of Twitter and trolling on the internet and on social media, that we really need to respect and support those who are asking the questions on our behalf. So support our journalists, support Black journalists, and let's keep, buy subscriptions to papers, all that good stuff, because all of that actually matters.
Thanks. And I'll just add that she said that it's important to have a free press in order to have a democracy. So we'll just remember that. So our first panel today is Doing It For Ourselves, Crafting Alternative Media Platform. And our moderator for this session is Chris Matthews. We'll just pass it on and get started. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Julian. Good morning, good morning, good morning. So excited to see everyone here at 9 o'clock in the morning. So we want to jump off this panel discussion right away. Each of the panelists will give a 10-minute presentation, and then we'll dive right into dialogue. So we didn't come up with who's going to go first, so whoever feels motivated. All right, Professor. Okay.
Are we supposed to sit or stand?
Whichever you're comfortable with.
Good morning, glad to be here. Thank you for coming out. There we go, thank you.
Stand up at the podium, please.
Well,
Absolutely.
there you go.
Is that better? All right, thank you, good morning, glad to be here. My name is Daniel McClure over there. I came here today to talk a little bit about some of my thoughts about something that people might be familiar with, but a very popular podcast through NPR or associated with NPR called Code Switch. And okay, great. Initially, my ideas were thinking about how to use it in a classroom. May get to that, probably run out of time, but just some general thoughts. The genesis. So Code Switch first premiered in 2013. Just by show of hands, I heard a little bit of enthusiasm. How many people have listened to this before? Everybody, most people. Okay, great. I have some quotes from Gene Demby, one of the creators of Code Switch, and he published an article, which I'll quote in the next slide, when the first episode was released, and this was the accompaniment to his story. So how many people recognize this? Okay, so this is the popular comedians, Key and Peele, and their actual comedic sketch of code switching with President Obama and his anger translator. Oh, here we go. So this is, I don't need to read the entire quote, but this is the title of the piece. Gene Demby released by way of explaining the intention of this podcast. And again, many of us are probably familiar with the idea of code switching, the idea of being able to shift culturally in different settings and use different voices, as I've highlighted there. So one of the things I'm thinking about right here is the ways that the creators of the podcast intended it to be, its mission or created, and then perhaps some of the different ways that it's been consumed and or thought about by National Public Radio. Do we all know who Dave Chappelle is, comedian? He famously had some thoughts on this about the intentionality of his work and then the way it was consumed. So the Code Switch project, one of the things, and again, it doesn't need to be a binary, but what I was thinking about was really when I listen to Code Switch, often in my car, try not to get too animated behind the wheel or run a red light or anything like that. But it's often there's certain content, let me look this way, content and subject matter that they cover, which I've broken into two categories. Sometimes they're introducing things into our public debate which are simply ignored or undervalued, and then other times it seems that they're commenting or trying to provide a corrective on things that are part of a national debate already. So again, Gene Demby, one of the co-creators here, and the idea of if you go to their website and see their little tagline of the way that they've presented themselves, marketed themselves, is it's called Code Switch and Race and Identity Remixed. So again, I don't need to read the entire quotation here, but the idea that they're talking about exploring different spaces, about having a dialogue, and trying to have a conversation. In a few slides, I will include the way that Code Switch is described and explained on the National Public Radio website, and some of the differences are subtle, but again, I'm trying to think this through myself about what this tells us about the opportunities for producing independent spaces for Black, in this case, media, or trying to enter majority mainstream spaces and simply change the conversation, provide correctives, shift the narrative. So one of the things that Gene Demby, again, in this initial article at the start of this podcast said is that they're not sticking to a strict linguistic definition of the idea of code switching, but trying to think about it, quote, more broadly, right? So as they say here, as we're looking at code switching a little more broadly, many of us subtly, reflexively change the way we express ourselves at all times, hopscotching between identities, things that we're probably familiar with. And the last bit is when you're attuned to the phenomenon of code switching, you start to see it everywhere. So again, they've given us some look at what it is that they're trying to do. What I thought was interesting, because I often hear, and probably many of you do, is either stories that emerge or begin on Code Switch and or people like Gene Demby and others ending up on other NPR formats or programs speaking about these things. So I was interested to see what that tells us as well. So 2 of the members are from NPR and shifted over this team. 6 were from outside. All right, so again, as I've already said, is I'm thinking about Code Switch's relationship to NPR here. And this is how National Public Radio explains what Code Switch is, explaining how race and culture permeate major issues in the news. And then here, this explanation on National Public Radio's website goes on to talk about the personhood or positionality of some of these journalists of color. So again, I think there's a lot of overlap, but I think there are, what I'm picking up on are some different agendas or missions. Agendas might be too strong a word, but different goals by the members of the team and then perhaps National Public Radio. Some of you might know late in the summer, I think it was in August, there was a bit of a controversy when the head of National Public Radio made some comments, yes, that many journalists of color objected to and wrote an open letter. So again, I don't want to make too much of that, but I think that there's something here which is not new to this project, which has existed probably since 1827 with John Russwurm and Freedom's Journal, but I'm always thinking about these issues. So the part I wanted to highlight was in the second paragraph is National Public Radio saying, with journalists of color, it's not just the work they do, but the lives they lead. And again, I always ask the question about when we're looking at news, what value are the journalists bringing, their experiential knowledge? Are we confusing their expertise in covering topics with who they are? They're not mutually exclusive, but I think there's different things going on here. All right, so I actually, at the end of this, and we probably won't have time, picked out 2 particular episodes of Code Switch that aired this fall that I was very interested in. And one of them, I think, is reshaping a conversation we're already having as a society about mass incarceration. It was particularly about the way this plays into democracy and elections in Wisconsin. And the other one was about, so this is the one I spoke of, and this is the little blurb right there. So the idea that elected officials in this one town in Wisconsin are counting incarcerated individuals who cannot vote as part of their constituencies. This is how they're getting elected. So I thought it was a really interesting way. Mass incarceration is a major problem, perhaps the most important pressing issue that we have, and just thinking about it in a different way. Another one on a bit of a different topic was here. How are we for time?
You're good.
Okay. Another one here was about rethinking the kind of ubiquity or the way that Shakespeare appears in curriculums and the way that we continue to teach it. I recently, 3 years ago, made the transition from teaching at university to teaching high school, and was not aware of how serious these debates were about should we or should we not teach Shakespeare. And I think I'm blanking on the person's name, the expert who was in this episode. She's a professor at Arizona State, but she had some really interesting, thought-provoking things for me, and I did almost go through a red light listening to this one. But basically, her point was in trying to reproduce Shakespeare with diverse casting, or trying to think about it differently and trying to subvert some of the racism that was there in several particular plays. She questions whether that's actually useful or not. So essentially, should we be trying to revise a conversation or simply scrap it and start a new one? So I thought these were 2 examples of episodes that were interesting to me. So again, in thinking, my thoughts about thinking about Code Switch, which I love, it sounds like a lot of people are fans of, just thinking about what it's really trying to do, and not in a judgmental way, but it's probably trying to do a few different things. It's trying to maintain some sort of semi-autonomous forum or public sphere, but it's also part of National Public Radio. So I know we don't have to go to these questions, but
We've got 1 minute.
all right, we'll leave them. So I created some questions, and if we come back to those, that's great. I'll
Thank
stop
you.
there. Thank you.
Would you like to go next?
Good morning. My name is Bob Greene. I'm from, well, Portland, Maine originally. I live in South Portland now. I heard it was warmer south, so. I listed my topic today as the invisible man. Throughout my career, I found that I was invisible. My freshman year, I graduated from Portland High School, and I went off my freshman year to Virginia State in Petersburg, Virginia, which, by the way, it's not in Petersburg, but that's another story. And I was a freshman, my second semester, freshman year, when Browne versus Board of Ed came down. So we're talking 1954, in case you're wondering. That's one of the few dates I remember. That one and my marriage date. I wanted to major in journalism, and Virginia State only had 1 3-hour course, so I transferred to the University of Kansas. My dad was from Kansas City and was He and my mom were living in Kansas City at the time, so I was only 40 miles away from the family. And there I majored in journalism. My first job was with the black newspaper weekly in Indianapolis, Indiana, the Hoosier Herald. And when I walked in to apply for a job, I was told they weren't hiring. And I said, no, you've got to hire me, I'm good. And they said, no. So I said, I'll give you a deal. I'll work for you for 2 weeks for free. And after that, you pay me what you think I'm worth. 2 months later, I was named managing editor of the paper. Unfortunately, money didn't always come with title. I was making minimum pay. But I learned a lot about newspapering at that weekly newspaper. I found that, as they had told me in school, all newspapers are local, with a couple of exceptions, I would say the Washington Post and New York Times. But all the other papers are local. You pick up your local paper to see your name. You pick up your local paper to see what's playing at your theater. You pick up your local paper to find out what your government is doing, your local government. And that stuck home to me. And that's what black newspapers were doing, was just local news. You find a lot of local papers still going on now. They're in German or in Finnish or in Chinese. By the way, the largest circulation newspaper in the world is a Chinese paper, and it's from Taiwan, but it's printed all over the world daily. You can go to any Chinese store and find it. It's remarkable. But one of the other things that I learned was the fickleness of the people, of the population. I had one, the Hoosier Herald was a tabloid-sized newspaper, so a lot of times the front page was just a big picture. And I remember one Easter, we had a beautiful, beautiful picture of a black altar boy and in front of the altar, and we couldn't give papers away. The next week, we printed a picture, a very out-of-focus picture of a body lying in a gutter with blood, and we almost, if we could have, we would have gone back for a second printing. I learned quickly what people wanted at that time. And I think it's still, I personally think it's still true now, it's just where they get it. After the Hoosier Herald, I worked for another Indianapolis black weekly very shortly called Indianapolis Voice, before I moved to Kansas City to the big time, the Kansas City Call, one of the largest black weekly newspapers in the country. And I worked for them. I was making $40 a week. We're talking almost 1960. Minimum wage was $1 an hour. And I asked for a $10 a week raise, and they gave me a raise to $42.50. And at that time, I was married and had 3 children with a 4th on the way. And on the week that they took out my Blue Cross Blue Shield, I took home like $12. So I started looking for something else. I ended up selling insurance, ended up with the post office, et cetera. And then one day, I heard that the Leavenworth Times, a daily newspaper in Leavenworth, Kansas, was looking for a photographer, a reporter, and a sports editor. And I went and applied for all 3. And this is one of the heroes in my life, was the editor that hired me. They really needed a sports editor, so that was the first time I really went into sports. Took that job and told him that I had asked around and told him that I would work for $80 a week. And he told me, with your family, you need more than that, so I'll tell the publisher you refuse to come under $95 a week. And I'm saying, no, I need the job. Anyway, I got that money, and I got the job. And that ended up with me changing once again to the Associated Press. Now, I got to go back and tell you one thing about the Hoosier Herald. One night, I was working, and we had the radio on as we were putting the paper to bed, as they say. And we heard a story over the radio that Emmett Till has been killed. So that was our front page story of that night. Now, I'll never forget putting together that, writing that story and everything, because we didn't have anything like a news service or anything. So, but that was putting together something that happened. And all during that period, I was working for a black weekly, and that was what we tried to push on. As I said before, with the Leavenworth Times, a daily newspaper, I was working, by the way, 5.5 days a week. Saturday, I had to put out the Sunday paper. We didn't publish on Sunday, except, well, we did have a Sunday paper, but we didn't publish on Saturdays, but we worked half a day putting out the Sunday paper. And then with the Associated Press, I made the big time. And I started going out covering events. I covered plane crashes, Mississippi River floods, and no one knew that it was black. So I wasn't known as a black writer. I became invisible. And then eventually I moved into sports with the Associated Press. In 1980, I was named the AP tennis writer. And I covered tennis all across the United States and Europe and China. And I was usually the only black covering tennis. You go to the NBA finals and the whole black reporting section is primarily black. But it got so bad that they would hold the Black Journalists Association meetings in Washington and forget to invite me. So I am the invisible man and have been. So I have also been working, well, let's see, I started in 1957, and 1956, excuse me, and I retired in 2001. So I put a few years and a lot of printer's ink in. I thank you for your indulgence.
On April 4th, 1968, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. And at that time, James Browne was scheduled to have a concert at the Boston Garden on the night of the 5th. The mayor of Boston had never heard of James Browne. His name was Kevin White, but he had a city council person named Tommy Atkins. And Tommy Atkins and some community leaders and a public television station, which is the oldest one in the country, WGBH, met with Mayor White in a series of hastily held meetings about the situation in the city, the potential for unrest and violence, and the role that the Browne concert might or might not play in either making people more upset than they already were or angered, especially teens, or the possibility that by staging the concert, it would divert attention and give teens an outlet who already had tickets, and the possibility of WGBH on the spur of the moment airing the concert as a means of quelling potential violence by giving people an outlet and encouraging them to stay home. So the council person and members of the TV station staff, the public TV station staff, had these meetings and tried to impress upon Mayor White the influence that James Browne had on communities like Roxbury and Dorchester and Mattapan and Jamaica Plain, and beyond that throughout the country, especially with young adults. So they gave him a sense of who Browne was and what he meant to those communities, and the mayor decided that it might be more wise to actually have the concert at the Garden, and he agreed to give WGBH some of the emergency and last-second support they would need to pull off the airing, given that it was a public TV station and not a network TV station, and they were airing a concert in a basketball and hockey arena with no planning, no production planning, hadn't checked out the venue for lighting or sound or any of those things. And then they had to, of course, incorporate Browne and his band and his staff with this last-minute change, because James Browne, of course, was very conscientious and very detail-oriented and astute and a perfectionist, like all band leaders are, about his performances. And coming into Boston before Dr. King was assassinated, he hadn't planned the event and the concerts, which were more than one night, around the fact that they would be aired live. He had planned them around the fact that his audience was an in-person audience. And those are two different types of ways to showcase an event and to frame it. It's like night and day difference. So he was brought into the conversation. He wasn't even there yet, but he was incorporated into the discussion. What came out of that was that unlike about 175 cities in the United States, Boston didn't really experience any unrest the night of the 5th, despite the shock and the grieving in the community and the unspeakable sense of loss and lack of direction. Where do we go from here? Especially with children who had grown up sort of following Dr. King on TV and in school and things like that through print media, electronic media, and through their parents' respect and in some cases reverence, in some cases maybe not reverence, about that figure and what he meant. So the fact that the concert was a performer who had a largely young audience, and that the children of Boston and Roxbury and Dorchester, Mattapan and Jamaica Plain were in shock and were out of school, and some of their peers would be attending the concert, in some cases themselves, in some cases their older brothers and sisters. All this was happening at the same time when WGBH was planning the broadcast. And WGBH took away from the impact that this decision had on the mood in the city and the difference in the reaction and how the city comported itself to how, say, maybe Washington, D.C. comported itself that night or those nights, or Chicago, or some other cities that had violence and unrest and business damage that affected some of the quadrants of those cities for 30 and 40 years in terms of where people lived and shopped and owned businesses. Boston largely escaped that in some part due to Browne and the way that he even handled himself when, if you've seen the concert or seen footage, there was some minor, there was potential that the police might have gotten nervous when some kids were doing things and they got excited and they wanted to come up and rush the stage and dance, and Browne wanted to allow them to do it, and the police were holding some of them back. So even during the concert, there was potential for things to go awry. But what WGBH took from that was the way that that impacted greater Boston. Maybe in our programming, rather than when we talk about the Negro problem or Negro issues, and we're discussing them from our point of view, maybe we should develop programming where Black Bostonians can discuss these issues from their point of view and shape them and frame them through their own lens. And so on July 15th, 1968, they debuted a program called Say Brother, which is still running. It's not called Say Brother now, but it still runs, and it's the longest running Black-oriented public affairs program in the United States. And WGBH is the longest airing public TV station in the United States. And what Say Brother did was they addressed issues of interest to the Black community as a whole, and Boston as a microcosm. Some episodes were particular to Boston, about Boston-oriented issues such as housing, in the mid-1970s forced school busing and all the controversy around that. Some episodes were more hosted, or where there would be a guest who was a noted artist, a noted poet, Gladys Knight and the Pips, Muhammad Ali, Negro League Baseball, explanation of what Kwanzaa is all about, holidays, anniversary of Dr. King's assassination and death and what it meant to America moving on. The wide variety of topics. And what the station became, in addition to a public affairs sort of pioneer or a landmark series in the United States, also became an incubator for producers who went on to become nationally known producers. In terms of its influence as a series that sort of helped give birth to other similar series, you have shows like Soul, which was hosted nationally, well, as New York Public TV, but became nationally broadcast out of New York City, hosted by Ellis Hazlip, beginning around 1969. You had Black Journal, which was also broadcast primarily on public TV and was later named Tony Brown's Journal, which was aired in a lot of markets nationally. In Washington, D.C., for instance, you had a show called Harambe, which was hosted by a lawyer named Carol Randolph. All these shows sort of come out of this, these cities and these urban cores searching to create public affairs programs where Blacks could lend voice to their own issues without the Boston Globe, the Boston Herald, the Boston Record American, WBZ, WHDH, lending the only insight and op-eds about those causes and issues. And the producers that came out of that incubation working on that program included Stan Latham, who went on to produce HBO's Def Comedy Jam, the sitcom Rock, several movies, as the father of actress Sanaa Latham. Topper Carew, who went on to produce the sitcom Martin, comes out of Say Brother and is a Boston native. Orlando Butch Bagwell, who's from Nashua, New Hampshire, and played high school football in New Hampshire, who went on to produce Eyes on the Prize, was a BU student who worked on Say Brother. So several producers that earned their chops or honed their teeth working on that program in their 20s became, in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, producers of national repute who all really worked with the staff of Say Brother. Sarah Ann Shaw, who was the first Black anchor woman in Boston Network TV, was one of the hosts of Say Brother. So it was a very, very important show at the time, and it still is. It goes under the iteration Basic Black. It's been called over the years things like Mrs. E. Roots. And format has been tweaked and changed based upon the times. In the late 70s, there was more focus on not just issues of interest to Black people or Black Bostonians or Black America, but also Latinx, Native Americans, and other groups that were underrepresented, especially on major media. And to this day, of course, the show is still running, so that would make 51 years. The episodes are archived online because there was an effort in the late 90s and early 2000s to document per episode the nature of each episode, the subject matter, the host, and all those in the early, maybe around 2001 or 2-ish, were documented in chronological order online, especially when it was under the iteration Say Brother, which was until about 1975. And it's just interesting to see how the effort of the city, the effort of an entertainer, the effort of a public TV station, a city council person, a mayor who had no clue who James Browne was, all came together to, in some ways, lead to the birth of a program that I think would have aired, let's see, July 15, aired 3 months in debut after the assassination of Dr. King, and the impact that that program has had on the lives of people who have enjoyed the programs and films developed by the producers that were young producers when they worked on that show and have become famous producers. Ms. Shaw and other journalists who worked on the show, people who worked behind the camera, the writers, and a lot of credit also must go to the person who was the president of WGBH for having the vision to think, it's time to let Black Bostonians discuss these issues and not have these issues be, presented to the public as the Negro problem, or what do Black people want, or why they're rioting, or why would you burn down your own neighborhood, or things are moving fast enough. Why do you want things going so fast? Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote a book called Why We Can't Wait. He wrote another book called Where Do We Go From Here? And even in the title, Why We Can't Wait, it sort of reflects his sentiment in the letter from a Birmingham jail, because so-called moderates and even some progressives would ask him things like, well, things are happening, and there's people being hired here, and there's a VP of this bank, and there's a woman over here who's been named this, and there's a person that's been named that. Why are you so adamant about, things happening right now? Change doesn't happen overnight. Even Browne versus Board of Education was about deliberate speed. And he was always, and many other people were of this mindset. When a person says that type of thing, first of all, they're not in your shoes, so it doesn't seem like a long time to them, but to you it's 310 years. And secondly, it always means to the person that's saying it, although some of them may have, in the letter to the Birmingham jail, he thought some of the white clergy of Birmingham had good intent, but it almost always leads to really, not right now means never. So Boston came together and created that program, which can still be seen today. And any questions would be certainly welcome about Say Brother and its subsequent titles over the years. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you for that enlightening journey. We went from code switching to the Invisible Man to James Browne. But I would like to begin our conversation together based on your personal experiences, and each of you come from a particular distinct background. Do you think that there will always be a need to provide some type of alternative platform, media platform for African Americans and Blacks?
Sure, yes. I do think there's always a need. I think that some of the practical realities is these attempts have been happening for more than a century, is the idea of having an independent platform, but particularly in places like New England where people, Black people in particular, have always been a minority, it might have to be semi-autonomous. It might have to be connected to something. So yes, I think it's necessary. The technology that's evolved provides different opportunities for thinking about what that might look like. But yes, it is necessary, I think.
A couple of things I'll go along with that. Feeling about having communities of color being covered by newspapers and being linked by newspapers. We have always been involved in journalism. I mean, I didn't realize it when I was beginning, but I have among the genealogists, I have a first cousin 5 times removed who was a writer for the New York Times in the 1800s. He also wrote for the Toledo Blade, for the New York Tribune, and he owned newspapers in Texas and in Louisiana. His name was George Thompson Ruby. There is a book that will be out about him very shortly by Carl Honeyman. But my grandfather, my mother's father, was a editorial cartoonist back during World War I. And he drew cartoons giving the black experience that appeared in not only black, but also some white newspapers around the eastern seaboard. And he was based out of Portland. So there have always been blacks in the media. The question is blacks reading the media. And as I said before, that is what we need, because it's local. It's telling what my kids do and my grandchildren and great-grandchildren. You know, it tells about our problems. And that's why we do need a black media, a black press.
Yeah, either one. You're both awesome.
Thanks. Your question is intriguing because now we live in a digital age of self-selected media, so people can create on their own platforms, especially if they are proficient in digital media and social media, and not necessarily even be very old. So even if there were not necessarily the market demand or the demographic demand for it, because people can self-select media and decide I only want to watch TV about weather or sports or fashion or home repair or flipping houses or black content or sports content, they can on their phone or on their TV or on their laptop or on their pad. But also they can create, because even a high school person or a college student can have an Instagram following or a Twitter following or a vlog on YouTube about Caribbean issues or about cosmetics or about hairstyling tips or about their culture or about people their age. So it's a little different now because it's not driven solely by like market demand and selling advertising, which is how most mass media was funded, is ad sales. It's sort of pushed and pulled by people who self-select, you know, I only want to follow conservative blogs, or I only want to follow the weather, so I only go to sites about the weather, or the way that their feed is responding to things, they only get searches about that particular thing. But I do think that it's interesting because even in the 70s and the 80s, and of course the late 1960s, in markets that were predominantly black, there was still a need for like a black public affairs TV show, even in maybe in Atlanta or Washington, which means they were underserved even though they were the majority, or someplace like Montgomery. And so obviously there's a need, but then I always think, you know, more like maybe like Baldwin or Dr. King, these issues that are being addressed in a format that maybe a person might follow that Twitter feed or that Instagram influencer because they post about black issues. The issues are really not just black. So if they're posting about how education affects their community, or if they're posting about how the justice system affects their community, or they're posting about how the environmental issues affect their community, it doesn't just affect their community because the society is a little bit more integrated than it used to be. So I think that it's important. Also, you see a lot of print magazines that we grew up on folding. that we used to consider like, that's the black, large, glossy magazine, or that's the black, small, closer to this size magazine that you always saw in the pharmacy and the supermarket. Those folded because of digital. But I do think that it's important to answer your question, it is, but I don't think that people should not pay attention to an issue and say, well, that doesn't affect me, I don't care about that, I didn't go to that kind of college, I don't go to that kind of church, I don't live in that kind of community, and think that there are US issues that don't affect them because they're not black.
So that leads me to kind of a tangent upon that. You really got me to thinking. It's often said that if you want to truly devalue a people, a group of people, begin the story with secondly. So then how can we as a community change the narrative utilizing these particular platforms? I just get to ask the questions. I have the easy job.
Well, I think, again, you know, like Baldwin and people like that, you have to impress upon people and remind people there's no Negro problem. Negroes didn't bring themselves here and create joblessness or the Civil War or enslavement or gender bias or the laws that this country has about firearms or the laws that this country had about firearms when the Black Panthers were in their heyday, which are not the laws that they have now. That's not a Negro it's not a problem created by Negroes. So when you're talking about media and news and outlets and what should lead and what should be on the third page and what should be in the city section and what should be in the sports section and what should be in the style section, what books should we review? We're all living in the same country, whether people want to look at it that way or not. We kind of still are physically. So the problems are just issues. They're not, you know, there's more poor white people in this country than black people. And people come to this state and try to, you know, play up things to sort of generate voting around that, like, oh, well, I'll go there because I know the opioid crisis has hit there harder. Yeah, okay, in Maine and parts of Massachusetts, and I get it because I'm from Boston. But that's not the way those issues about abuse and addiction were framed when they were considered black, the Negro problem. So.
So I want to circle back a little bit to the code switching. Sure. Can you pick out and select maybe one of those key questions that you had that you feel is the most relevant and kind of wrap us back there?
Yeah. I mean, I think the central question that I was interested in is the first one that you posed, is it desirable and possible to develop and sustain an independent forum? And I think to your second question that you just posed, I don't necessarily have the answer, but the questions that I'm asking is if you are interested, one, in creating an independent forum, is it simply to have another spin on issues, whether it is drug abuse, whatever it might be, epidemics that are being covered elsewhere, or is it to have an entirely new conversation? In other words, introduce new topics, new ways of discussing. And again, this idea of technology means that you've changed the relationship between the media outlet and the audience in ways that can be potentially more democratic. There's been a lot of chatter about that, but yeah, so I think those are the two things I'm thinking about. I'm not sure that I have an answer, and I don't know that it needs to be one or the other, but that's what I'm trying to think about with things like Code Switch. What are they doing, and how is it different from, I don't know, the journal Fire that was started during the New Negro Renaissance, which didn't last very long?
So the audience, just so you know, you will have your opportunity to ask questions. So I will be calling on you soon shortly, so start the wheels processing. Want to go to my brother here. Can you walk me through kind of, you mentioned, and I wrote it down, a quote that kind of really stuck with me, that you kind of felt or saw yourself as this invisible reporter, right?
Example of my invisibility came in 1968. I covered for the Associated Press. I was sent to Martin Luther King's funeral. My job was to sit in the Ebenezer Baptist Church, where the body lay in state, and keep track and report about the various celebrities or people that came and viewed the body. At one point, some men dressed in suits, as most of us were, went through and were whispering to people that were seated there, and they got up and left. Nobody came to me, and I didn't know, I really wasn't paying that close attention. I was paying more attention to the people passing by to view the body. And finally, I was like one of the very few people left. And they closed off the viewing line. And in walks the family, and then Bobby Kennedy and his wife Ethel. I think I was the only reporter there. Well, I found out later that what they were going around telling all of the reporters they had to leave, that it was going to be a private viewing. They didn't come to me because the police thought I was a member of the Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity, which were actually doing the funeral services. And the AFIAs thought I was a cop. So I got to be the only reporter. To be honest about it, I did not write the fact that Bobby Kennedy refused to look at the body, and instead was gazing at the beautiful ceiling of the church, while Ethel took a long, long time staring at the body of Martin Luther King.
Thank you. All right, audience, are you ready? You have about 10 minutes for this lively dialogue. Okay, right. So if you can just state your name and then your question.
Yes, I'm Elizabeth from Concord. It strikes me that probably many of us are schooled in news.
Lovely and loud is a good alliteration and a good thing to be.
I don't think so.
I think they can hear you. She's good. Loud and lovely. Let's go with loud and lovely.
So, yeah, let's go ahead and have you just to project.
She can.
Got you.
I forgot about the digital era.
Oh, perfect.
I forgot we were in the digital era.
I didn't even think it was there.
Hello. All right.
Thank you. So I think many of us probably have been schooled in NPR News and think of it as a pretty credible source. And I'm one of the many gray hairs in New Hampshire. And what I've learned, my children were schooled with NPR and with getting a weekly news magazine and getting a daily local paper. However, none of them subscribe to news, and they're all millennials. On the other hand, they do listen to podcasts. And I learned to my surprise, probably on one of the fund drives for our local NHPR, that there were some young people who were listening to podcasts that were produced by NPR, having no idea what NPR was. So it was their segue into learning about news. So my point is, what that says to me is, we can preach all we want about the written word, but if they're not going to read it on their phone, they're not going to care. Because even those of us who have raised them to be aware, they're getting it through their car radio or through their pods or whatever. So that's the reality. How do you address that fact?
Well, when I do branding and media relations work, one of the things I tell people about their messaging and their mission and their outreach is meet your audience where they are. So it's different doing it for a brand or a sports league or a commercial product or an advocacy group or a nonprofit than it is for a news outlet. But on the other hand, the struggle or the challenge of the last 15 or 18 years from news outlets, which has led to some of the print media like National Geographic and some other, Sports Illustrated, I think, laid off a couple hundred people the other week. Some of the publications like Ebony and Jet having to downsize their print or conventional staffs is probably not enough people in the late 90s and early 2000s made that transition to meet all of their potential audiences where they were. And that, if you want to call it a strong word, is a failure, or that oversight may have led to some missed opportunities, because anything that you're going to market, whether you're marketing it to sell it or brand it or tell a story about it, or whether you're marketing it to report about something. And again, advertising was always the way that newspapers and magazines and television programs and radio programs funded themselves, except public. You have to change with the times, like radio did through TV, through digital, through VHS and all those formats, DVD, to create content in a manner in which the recipient is more apt to want to receive the content.
There was a question in the back. Oh.
Recently, we lost our Ebony magazine. Do you think that they lost it because of the management or because they didn't keep up with the changing in time?
I don't really know either way, but my feeling was that they weren't able to keep up with the public, and they lost too much circulation. Now, why, I don't know. I know problems. I don't know how to fix them.
I don't have any insights into the particular goings-on, the backgrounds with that publication, but I think it raises a larger question about the earliest black newspapers. One of the things they were trying to do is create a national black community, and if we look at that today, how do we look at this? I think how black people consider themselves, how we consider race, how we consider ourselves as a community, that's changed. And Ebony, as well as many other publications, were meant to serve a particular configuration of what a black community looked like, and I'm not sure that that is the same thing now. So we miss it, though.
There is one other thing I do want to add. Times have changed, and I understand that and realize it. The reason black media, newspapers began was because that was the only place you could get news about black folk. Nowadays, this morning, there's a beautiful story in the local Manchester newspaper about black people. And so that's where a lot of the problem has come. How do you battle City Hall, so to speak? Because City Hall is now including us.
Hello, I'm over here. Thank you all for this conversation. I think it's great, and I love raising up Code Switch. And there is like really great journalism. I'm from Chicago. My name's Ross, and there's really great journalism happening in Chicago. The Defender just went digital, which is kind of sad because a lot of people still use paper. You know, they need their paper delivered, but Block Club Chicago, City Bureau. All brand new within the last 2 years, like new young people involved in news delivery and community news delivery in Chicago. Look it up, it's really dope. the question I had is about intellectual history, because as these black newspapers are disappearing or contracting, or black news organizations are contracting, like the format is kind of, okay, I don't buy paper, but I'm on, I read a lot of magazines. But the people who do the work and the knowledge they can pass on to younger folks who want to do that work, sometimes those connections might be missed. And so I'm just wondering if y'all could have a conversation about connecting the legacy folks that were connected to black newsmaking with, like, the number of people I know who are doing journalism that are black in Chicago. There's a lot of them, right? And they're not on, they're not on platforms. And I've been really, really fascinated by the work that NPR has done with Latino USA, with Code Switch, to kind of raise up black and brown voices within that organization. That's mostly been with the black and brown folks in NPR, because it was a fight to get a regular segment on Code Switch live on air, right? They were a podcast for a long time, and then there was a push to have NPR put them on air. And so it was a great disrespect for the president to not even know that, right? But I wonder if you could just talk about legacy, elders in that field, and the misconnections that might be happening between young folks trying to do journalistic work. Thanks.
Yeah, really quickly, as my colleagues mentioned, I think you raise a great question, and there's several strands there, is the idea of professional organizations that are mentoring young journalists. He also mentioned the idea of courses, college courses. Something I was thinking of is coming from a background thinking about research. So there's certain topics, whether it's, for instance, Black Power movement, things like that often many researchers and thinking about working with students doing research, some of the only sources they have are often these newspapers. There are events that were not documented well. I think there's also researchers and scholars now who are acknowledging what you just said and writing books about these newspapers, about individual reporters, using these sources to try to keep them alive. One of the things I was thinking of this summer, and you might remember or know, but I think it was around 94, 95, NPR gave two young African-American boys a recorder and a platform when Greene was getting torn down. And I thought that was a really interesting moment that I would like to see more of. It's kind of the idea of the citizen journalism model. So I think that's also something which is part of this conversation that you're speaking of, how to preserve legacies and have it be a two-way conversation between the youth and the elders. So great question.
Thank you.
My parents subscribed to Ebony when it first started. And I have been a long-term subscriber. My feeling is best reflected by my great uncle, T.C. Johnson, who a long time was history teacher at Crispus Attucks High School in Indianapolis and wrote articles on your history for the Indianapolis Recorder. I remember talking to him when I was a student at Indiana University in the early 50s. He was displeased with how Ebony was portraying people of African ancestry. He thought they were going more to sensationalism. And I remember him saying when he saw Isaac Hayes laying across one of his 26 cars, this is the wrong impression. In the early 50s, there was a competing black magazine called Our World. It had features of great substance. It showed the history of black people and the nobility and the resilience. And it sort of went out of publication because so much of younger black America wasn't interested in these things. So I think that you have to be resilient to move with the times and go from, materialistic fluff to something of value, and to show, the dynamic things that black people did in their early days. I mean, how many people know that it was a black engineer that designed the hydraulic brakes for Westinghouse, but in those days, he couldn't get the patent because it had to be assigned to Westinghouse. So these things, a lot of things that our world would bring out. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Wayne Dawkins. I'll be presenting later, and I teach American media history. So I wanted to take a crack at that Ebony question because it's still kind of dangling out there. First of all, Ebony ran smack into the Great Recession. It was just an economic reality. The irony is, just as they broke out of that kind of bougie formula that black folks had criticized for decades, particularly the critics, they started to update, but they ran into the Great Recession like most media and just couldn't recover. The only saving grace is that Mel D. Hobson and George Lucas bought the archive before it fell into the wrong hands, and it's now going to what we now affectionately call the Blacksonian in Washington. So there's that. And you're talking about how media has changed. You know, local newspapers have been hollowed out. The New York Times, Washington Post, and Wall Street Journal will be fine, but that's what we're dealing with. But I will give one bright spot, Essence Magazine. Essence Magazine, after the Great Recession, was probably the only magazine, mainstream or not, that survived it and was still profitable. And one thing that helped them was what helped subsidize the magazine is that spectacular Essence Festival in July that brings in money and they funnel it to the magazine. So, you know, there are economic realities we just have to constantly battle.
I have the privilege of the mic, and I'm just going to add that the Essence also has a podcast that, in terms of, you're talking about hitting all the media and where the audiences are, right? They have the festival, they have the podcast, they have the magazine, they have stuff on Instagram constantly, right? So for people who are only doing social media, they're using these other platforms as well as the print magazine as well.
One thing while you're talking about that, yes, Ebony went under, but so did Life, Look, Saturday Evening Post, and a number of other of those types of magazines. So.
One of the themes yesterday was the irony of one ironic consequence of the eventual opening up of positions in national platforms to African American reporters, and the way in which let me try this a different way. I'm wondering whether when Say Brother got going, as remarkable as that was, the people who were doing the program had as much editorial and freedom of expression as they would have if they hadn't been on a platform that was a national platform like GBH. Was there any editorial constraint that that they wouldn't have experienced if they'd been in a in a purely black press context?
Well, given the atmosphere or the news ecosystem of the primary, of the sort of core years when it was called Say Brother, which is 68 to 75, it's, from what I've heard from people who worked on the series, I don't want to put words in their mouth and say they had free reign, but as opposed to what the alternatives would have been in 68 to 75, especially in that particular market, which was only about 13 to 15% black, and in a market that still had 3 papers, and in a market that, as you all know, of course, living here, some of you live here, serves more than one New England state. It's not like it was Gary, or it's not like it was LA, or it's not like it was Atlanta, or Baltimore. So given what the alternatives would have been, they probably had as much license as anyone, because again, they were producing, and also most of the producers who developed the content between 68 and 75 were either still attending BU or fresh out of Boston University, so they were not generationally removed from some of the issues that we're talking about today about how do you best serve younger audiences if you're not trying to meet them where they are, if they prefer to receive things digitally. Because Stan Lathan was so young, and the Topper Carew was so young and under 30, and people of that nature, and Bagwell when he came slightly later, they were living in Roxbury and Dorchester and Mattapan and Jamaica Plain, and they were not parents, and they were not council persons, and they were not writing for the Globe or the Herald or the Record. So they you can tell if you look at like the episodic chronicle list of what the topics were, nobody from the station would have suggested from the top down that they do, you know, those themes, like a Kwanzaa theme, or a theme about the glory of Negro League baseball, or that they would have had programming where they would have addressed the forced busing issue with the voice that people very seldom got to hear about how Roxbury and Dorchester and Mattapan felt about forced busing, which was no more enthusiastic than the way that Charlestown and Hyde Park and Southie felt about forced busing. It's just, it wasn't as widely nationally known, and even somewhat locally known, that the black parents and the black kids were not crazy about getting up at 5:30 or 6 o'clock in the morning when it gets dark in the fall and going to Hyde Park High School where they didn't know any of the kids. They weren't on the sports teams. They weren't in the chess club. They didn't have social connections. And they had to ride 4 buses. And those schools, and the reason why Judge Garrity created the forced busing in the first place, the Ruth Batson study where she studied the poor schools in the working class Irish districts like Southie and Hyde Park and Charlestown, they had the same dropout rates and the same percentage of kids who went on to college as the kids from the Roxbury and Dorchester schools. So taking those kids and sending them to bad white schools that also had gangs and also had poverty, and the kids also lived in the projects, and Charlestown has the highest concentration of bank robbers in the United States. It's not like these parents were like, oh, wow, my kid is gonna go get an education at Southie. So those kind of things, you're not gonna hear that in 1974, 75, and 76, top down from somebody who's a WBZ or HDH anchor. You're more likely to hear that from a parent or from the people who are living in the community who were working on series like Say Brother.
One of the things that I realized pretty quickly in the newspaper field, and that includes the wire services, was the power of the editors and the people that run things on picking what stories we're going to go out and cover, and which side. I think it was 1966 or 67. There was a riot in Omaha, Nebraska, and I was sent in to help cover it with the local Associated Press people. And one of the things I found immediately was a barber, a black barber, who, I can't remember his name right now, unfortunately. I'm getting old, I forget a lot of things. But he knew everything that was going on. He had the touch, he knew the people in the city and everything else. and I interviewed him. And when the mayor heard about my interview, he told the whites at Associated Press that this guy was nobody and we didn't need to use him. And I ended up, they didn't use his quote, so I ended up having to call New York and fight, and I got some of them put back in the story. But it was that viewpoint that only the editor, not even the publishers below that, it's the executive editor, et cetera, they decide which stories to cover and which way to go on it. And that's a big hurdle in a lot of places.
I don't have a question. Flip the switch. Okay. I'm a professional, I know. I'm Kevin Wade Mitchell, and I just want to make a comment about Say Brother, as I used to watch it when I was a kid. It was one of my favorite shows besides Soul Train. Now, not only did it touch on social issues and things that were going on in the day, issues of the day, but it had some of the best music groups you've never heard of. I mean, you had like Jimmy Briscoe and the Little Beavers, which was like a carbon copy of the Jackson 5. You had Black Ivory. Lucky Peterson made one of his first appearances on there. He wasn't a famous blues singer at the time. He was a 6-year-old who played a Hammond B3 organ, and his father James brought him on there, which he later appeared on the Tonight Show. So, I mean, it was just all around, it was just a great program. You know, with the consciousness, kept the people's consciousness out there, and like I said, it had some of the best groups that you never heard of. So if there is stuff on the archives, check the show out.
That was the last question.
Oh, was that our last question?
Hello. I just wanted to clarify something when you were talking about busing the students in the 60s. Did you say they were being bused? I mean, I maybe didn't hear the whole thing, but my impression from your comment was that they were being bused to communities that had the same kinds of dropout rates as where they came from. And I have to tell you that they bused to my community when I was in high school, which was Wellesley, not exactly dropout city. And so there was a lot of good that came from that, I think. I was living in a primarily white community, and I was a senior at the time, and I think that was really one of the first times I saw very many people of color. So that's a good thing. You got to start someplace, and it was a good program.
Yeah, that's like the Biden, Kamala Harris. I wasn't addressing kids that went to like Natick and Framingham and Wellesley and Milton Academy and Metco and those kind of programs. I was addressing the forced busing ordered by Judge Garrity, where he sent poor kids from Irish enclaves into Roxbury, and then he sent kids from Roxbury over to like Irish communities such as Hyde Park High School, Charlestown High School, and South Boston High School. Not so much the Metco program, which is kids went to Lexington and they went to Archbishop Williams and Braintree, and they integrated Thayer Academy, and you know they started going to Fessenden and all that. That's a whole. Some of those schools are private, and that's a whole different conversation that Kamala Harris and Joe Biden got into about forced busing, and busing did some good, and I wasn't talking about that. I was talking about Ruth Batson's study, where she studied the public high schools in Boston's core and the public high schools in Southie and Hyde Park and Charlestown. And they had identical rates of college admission and identical dropout rates, and they had some of the same, basically the people were the same socioeconomic level. So she wanted to study them, and the only reason for the busing was not that you're going to get a better education if you go over here and go to school at Southie. The busing was to integrate the schools. So it wasn't like sending you to Archbishop Williams or Thayer or the school that you teach at now or Fessenden. It was just literally to integrate the schools.
Thank you. If we can give a hand to our panelists, they were amazing this morning. Okay, thank you, gentlemen. Thank you. Okay. So there is a few minutes break, right, before we begin panel number four.
I don't have one, Moderator, but you're going to hear from me. No.
Good job, good job, good job. We're 7 minutes ahead of schedule.
That's why I passed it back to you.